I'll start this story by being honest about something. I am not, or rather, I was not one of those who believe in legends. I have spent my whole life working on the road, covering miles and miles of asphalt, and the only things I have seen are accidents caused by lack of sleep or recklessness. However, there is a story that every truck driver in Saladillo knows. A story that I never took seriously until I experienced it firsthand. When I heard the other truckers talk about the La Muerta de Saladillo, I just laughed. They said she was a woman who would appear on the road if you were alone, especially in the early hours of the morning. She was described as a woman dressed as a bride with a pale face and a lost look who would get in the truck and ask you to take her home. What happened next was what made me laugh. They claimed that these truck drivers ended up dead in unexplained accidents, overturning their vehicles for no apparent reason. Anyway, my story began on a Tuesday night. The road was clear, the night was calm, and the radio kept me company. The first signs that something was wrong appeared when my radio started malfunctioning. The stations would cut out and go on in white noise. I tried turning to another station, but none seemed to work. It wasn't the first time this happened, and I wasn't nervous, but I was a little annoyed. I turned off the radio, trying to concentrate on the road. Out of nowhere, the temperature inside the truck dropped drastically. I felt a bone-chilling cold that didn't come from the air conditioning or the night outside. I had no companion, but suddenly, I felt less lonely. That's when I saw her in the passenger seat, as real as the road in front of me. A woman dressed as a bride, her dress dirty and torn, her skin pale, and her long black hair falling over her shoulders. Her eyes were black and seemed to extend beyond her iris. She stared at me, unblinking. I panicked, but my body didn't respond. I wanted to brake, open the door, and jump out of the truck, but my hands gripped the steering wheel with force. My mind screamed, but I couldn't move. I couldn't look away from the terrifying figure sitting next to me. It was then that she spoke to me. "Take me home." I sped up without thinking. I don't know why. Again, I didn't feel like I was doing this consciously. It was as if someone was controlling my hands. But no matter how hard I pressed the pedal, she was still there, not moving, not looking away. The road in front of me was getting blurry. I was finding it harder and harder to drive. I felt that every meter I went, I was getting closer to certain death. Warning signs began to appear on the road, but I couldn't understand what they said. Should I turn? Should I slow down? At that moment, I had forgotten how to travel the road I had traveled for so many years. And then, at the edge of my sanity, I knew. If I didn't find a way to stop, if I didn't do something to get her out of my truck, I wouldn't see the sunrise. I decided to try the only thing I could think of at that moment. Talk to her. My lips were dry, and my voice was trembling when I finally managed to force the words out. "Where is your house?" I wasn't sure if I wanted to hear the answer, but I couldn't see any other way out. "Turn right in a few yards." I tried to listen to her and stay as calm as possible, but when I got to the meters she indicated, there was no road. The road went straight ahead, and there didn't seem to be a turnoff anywhere. Confused, I glanced towards her, hoping for some sign that I had misunderstood the indication, but her expression remained unchanged. I decided to move on, thinking that perhaps I had made a mistake, that perhaps the path lay ahead. However, after several seconds, no exit appeared, no sign that I should turn. Suddenly, the atmosphere inside the cabin changed. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I noticed the woman staring at me with eyes alight with fury. It was the first time her face had shown anything different. "Where are you taking me? Didn't you hear me? Are you making fun of me?" Fear began to grip me, making my hands tremble on the steering wheel. I tried to explain, stammering that I hadn't seen any road. But before I could finish, the woman turned her body towards me with unearthly speed, bringing her face close to mine. "Take me home! Take me home! Take me home! Take me home!" Her scream was so intense that I let go of the steering wheel for a second, and the truck, out of control, swerved sharply to one side. I struggled to regain control, but it was too late. The vehicle skidded on the wet, slippery road, and in a matter of seconds, I felt gravity shift around me as the truck began to tip over. Everything happened in slow motion. The sounds of metal twisting and glass shattering mingled with the woman's screams. My body was thrown violently into the cab, hitting the steering wheel and the roof as the truck spun around. Finally, everything came to a screeching halt, and the world faded into darkness. I woke up with a stabbing pain all over my body. There was blood on my face, and I felt a constant ringing in my ears. It took me a moment to realize that the truck was overturned on its side, and I was trapped in my seat, hanging on by my seatbelt. I managed to unbuckle the belt and fell to the cab floor with a groan of pain. My vision was fuzzy, but I could see the lights of the rescue vehicles approaching. How long had I been unconscious? I tried to move, but every movement brought me so much pain. All I could do was wait while the rescuers pulled me out of the wrecked truck. Once outside, they placed me on a stretcher and began to check my injuries. I wanted to tell them what had happened, how that woman had made me overturn the truck, but I could barely mumble a few words before the paramedic gave me something for the pain. A few weeks later, when I finally managed to explain what had happened to my colleagues, I expected them to look at me in disbelief, to think that the blow to the head had made me hallucinate. But to my surprise, they seemed to get angry with me. "Didn't you use a chalan?" I was too confused to answer immediately, but he continued before I could articulate a response. "Everyone who works on this route knows that you don't travel alone at night, especially not on this road." "Didn't you have a dummy or something? You could have asked us." I was silent. I couldn't believe that nobody was scared by what I told them. I didn't understand how you get to the point of naturalizing something as bizarre and terrifying as the fact that out of nowhere, a ghost could enter your truck. From that day on, I never drove alone at night again. Whenever I had to work, I made sure to take a chaperone with me. At first, it felt weird to drive with a stuffed animal next to me, but hey, it's better than a ghost woman. I never talked about what happened that night to anyone again, but I didn't have to. That legend was so normal that when they talked about it like it wasn't weird at all. That night, I stopped laughing at trucker legends and accepted that there were things I would never understand. I now knew an unwritten rule that everyone followed. Never travel alone at night, and never ignore la muerta de Saltillo. This story is based on La Muerta de Saltillo, a woman dressed as a bride who is said to appear in Saltillo. Although this woman can appear in any car, this legend takes on more force in truck drivers who have to put a doll on the side of the passenger seat. If they don't, it is said that she will appear asking to be taken home. With more than 15 years on the road, I'm sure you must think I've seen it all. And you're right. I've seen terrible accidents, sunrises that make you feel alive, and a night so dark you wonder if you'll ever see daylight again. But nothing compares to what happened to me that night in a rest area in the middle of nowhere. Sometimes I think it was a dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But the marks on my truck remind me that it was real. But let me tell you how it all happened before you can draw your conclusions. I had been driving for hours and sleep was starting to get to me. It was one of those nights that you felt like it goes on forever and that at any moment you will fall asleep. The radio was barely audible and the headlights of my truck illuminated just enough to see a few meters ahead. At that moment, I couldn't help but think that if I had an accident, no one would rescue me, as there probably wasn't a person around for miles. Suddenly, something caught my attention. In the distance, a figure appeared on the side of the road. My headlights shone on it for an instant, and I swear I saw a man standing there, staring straight at my truck. He was wearing some kind of long coat, and something was shining in his hand. Something I couldn't identify. Normally, I would think he was a lost person, but he didn't seem to need help. He wasn't hitchhiking me. No, quite the opposite. He seemed to be smiling at me. As strange or unwarranted as this seemed, I was terrified of this person. I looked in the rearview mirror to make sure I wasn't imagining things, but the man had disappeared. There was no sign of him. I told myself that I was seeing things, that tiredness was playing tricks on me, and that maybe I had fallen asleep for a moment. I decided that this was the sign I needed to stop at the next rest area and get some sleep. I found a rest area a few kilometers further on. It was a normal place with a couple of toilets, a few picnic tables, and ample parking. There was no one else there, which was not unusual for this time of night. I parked my truck and leaned back in the seat. I closed my eyes, trying to erase the image of the man on the road from my mind. I just needed a couple of hours of sleep, and then I could be on my way. I woke with a start, a sharp sound like metal scraping against something hard. Suddenly, I woke up. At first, I thought I was still dreaming, but the sound repeated itself, this time closer, more insistent. It was as if someone was scratching at the door of my truck. I sat up in the seat and looked towards the door, expecting to see someone there, but there was nothing. Maybe it was just the wind, I thought to myself, but the explanation didn't convince me. I looked in the rearview mirror, and there was nothing there either. I was quite confused. Those noises had felt quite real. As I relaxed, the noise started again, this time accompanied by a thud on the door. I quickly looked in the mirror again, and what I saw froze my blood. A human face. A human face was standing next to my truck, staring into the rearview mirror as if expecting me to see it. Fear paralyzed me for a moment, but soon the adrenaline kicked in. I leaned back in my seat, trying to understand what was happening. That scraping sound of the door became more violent. The metal creaked and the door shook under the onslaught. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't my imagination. There was something trying to get in. The pounding intensified, and I knew I had to do something as soon as possible. This person wasn't going to break down a truck door, but he was damaging it. I thought about running away, but to be honest, I wasn't scared anymore. I was furious. I grabbed the baseball bat I had to defend myself and angrily opened the door. I was both confused and shocked. There was no one there. The uncertainty was driving me crazy. I knew someone had been there, but the place was empty. Maybe he had run and hid. It didn't make sense. I would have heard him. I looked around, expecting to see the intruder, but all I saw was darkness. The rest area was completely deserted. My truck was covered in deep scratches, as if someone had run a blade over the paint. The cuts were long and precise. This man was dangerous. He had a knife. I decided I couldn't stay there. I got into the cab, closed the door, and started the engine. I started the truck and drove away from the rest area. I may not have slept enough, but that experience had left me with enough adrenaline to keep me awake all night. I hadn't gone far when I heard a thud on the roof, then another. It was as if someone was walking on the truck, or maybe hitting it with something heavy. I looked in the mirror in confusion, hoping to find nothing, and to my luck, I saw nothing. At that moment, I saw it. It was a dark figure leaning out of the passenger side window. It was the man I had seen on the road, the same man who was scratching my truck. Now he was there, looking at me from the roof of my truck. In addition to seeing his face peering out, I also saw his hand. That wasn't a knife. It was a hook. My reaction was instinctive. I hit the brakes with all of my might. The truck came to a screeching halt, and the man with the hook was thrown off the roof, rolling across the asphalt. I sat there for a moment. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I could see his body still through the window of the truck. I got out of the truck once again, this time with the wheel spanner firmly in my hands. As soon as I opened the door and got out of the truck, the body was gone. I walked slowly to the front of the vehicle, hoping to find the man limping around, at least injured, but there was nothing. No trace of blood, no body of that man. Just the empty road. At that moment, I considered a paranormal explanation. The man couldn't get up so quickly. But at that moment, I realized something terrible. Whether or not something paranormal had happened, I was in danger. If it wasn't a ghost or something weird, a man who wasn't hurt was circling the area. I climbed into the truck and, hands shaking, started the engine again. I drove aimlessly, not worrying about direction. I just wanted to get away. It was hours before I dared to stop again. This time at a well-lit service station with other people around. I turned off the engine and dropped into the seat, exhausted. My whole body was shaking and cold sweat covered my skin. The service station seemed like a haven, but I was still scared. For a moment, I tried to sleep, but I knew it would be impossible. I went into the station shop, bought a strong coffee, and sat down to wait for the sun to rise. I didn't dare go back on the road until it was daylight. I didn't see the man with the hook again. At first, I didn't tell anyone what happened that night. Who would have believed me? Who would have believed that a man with a hook in his hand chased me on the road, scratched my truck, and almost made me lose my head? Eventually, I began to tell my story and ask questions, and apparently, I wasn't the only person who had seen the man with the hook. When I found out that his existence was an urban legend, I decided not to find out more. I had heard enough. From that day on, I calculated very well my schedule, when I would arrive at a rest area, and how crowded it was. Whether the hook man was real or not, I was never going to allow myself to be helpless against him again. And if I met him again on the road, I will simply speed up and not stop until daylight. This story is based on the legend of the hook. This legend began when a man with a hook in his hand escaped from an insane asylum and murdered a couple in a car in the middle of the road. Since that day, it is said among the truck drivers that the man is still on the roads, looking for unsuspected people who stop their car to chase them and kill them like that couple.
Hey, I'm Randy, and as you can imagine, I'm a truck driver. You know, I've crossed roads that go through mountains, deserts, and sleepy towns in the middle of the night. I've seen beautiful places, but I've also seen places that seemed extremely dangerous. Steep areas or unstable roads that I took accidentally or in search of an unnecessary shortcut. But nothing I experienced resembles what I went through that night. The night I saw Marfa's lights. I was hauling a load of auto parts, heading west on Route 67 in Texas. The road was empty, as it always is at that hour. The radio had lost signal for miles, and the silence was starting to get uncomfortably quiet. I had become very radio dependent. Then I saw them. They were like lights, floating in the distance, moving strangely. I thought it might be a car from the distance, a bug, or just something I didn't understand, but their movement was very irregular. I braked the truck, intrigued. I parked on the side of the road, got out of the vehicle, and lit a cigarette. The lights were still there, in the distance, moving slowly. Something about them was hypnotic. They seemed to be getting closer, but never quite did. They were a strange glow, a color I had never seen before, not even in the headlights of the newest cars. Something inside me told me I should stay in the truck, but curiosity got the better of me. I approached the edge of the road, trying to get a better look. I looked at the clock. More time had passed than I thought. It was time to be on my way. I still had miles to go before I could rest. I put out my cigarette, got into the truck, and turned the key in the ignition, but the engine did not respond. I turned the key again and again, but the truck's engine only made a faint clicking sound. A cold feeling ran down my spine. The truck, which had never given me any problems, was now completely dead. There was no signal on the mobile phone, the radio was silent, and I was stranded in the middle of nowhere. The only thing I could do was get out of the truck and check the engine. Maybe something simple, a fuse, a loose wire, nothing I couldn't fix with the tools I had in the cab. But just as I was getting ready to get out, something caught my attention. A sound. It was just a whisper at first, like the wind through the branches, but then it got louder. It was a rustling sound, as if something was moving in the undergrowth beside the road. I raised my head and looked into the woods, but saw nothing. The sound was getting closer, one step at a time. I crouched down, trying not to make a sound, and my hand slipped into the glove compartment. There I had a revolver, a small safety measure I always carried with me. Now the gun felt more necessary than ever. I grabbed the revolver and held it firmly. The noises were getting louder, surrounding me. I decided to get out of the truck. If something was coming towards me, it was better not to be locked in. I moved slowly towards the front of the vehicle, keeping my eyes on the forest. Suddenly, a rustle louder than the others sounded to my right. I turned quickly, pointing the revolver. Still, nothing there. As I continued to scan the area, I noticed that the lights had come very close. It was as if they were floating towards me, approaching faster and faster. In an instant, one of those lights shot out of the sky straight toward me. This was a different light. This light came from the sky while some of the others were in the ground. This one also was way bigger than the lights I saw before. It was blinding and fear gripped me. Instinctively, I pulled the trigger and fired into the air, not knowing if I would hit something or if I was just shooting into the void. I panicked and ran into the woods, not knowing where to go, just wanting to get away from the thing. I fired one more shot, but the gun didn't give me any safety. I was alone in the middle of the darkness, and that light, it was coming for me. The forest was thicker than I remembered. In addition to the light, I heard footsteps behind me. Several people were following me. But when I turned my head, I couldn't see what was chasing me. I was very nervous, and my legs began to feel weaker and weaker. My steps began clumsy, and for a second I thought about stopping, confronting whatever was there. But the fear was too much. For some inexplicable reason, I kept running deeper and deeper into the undergrowth, firing at random, hoping that one of the shots would scare away whatever was chasing me. Suddenly, my legs collapsed. I fell to the floor on my knees and couldn't get up. My breathing became irregular, and my eyelids began to droop. I tried to stay awake. It was as if I was being drugged. Meanwhile, the footsteps were still there, getting closer, but I no longer had the energy to get up. My body slumped to the wet ground, and before I lost consciousness completely, something approached me. They were humanoid figures, like small humans without clothes. I couldn't see their faces or any features, as everything was blurry. I tried to focus more, but the opposite happened. My eyelids had already given out. Everything went black, and the next thing I knew, I was somewhere completely different. Everything was dark, except for the intermittent flashes of light. Everything that came after that is very confusing. I remember being in a bed or something. I felt tight straps around my wrists and ankles. I tried to move, but it was hard to breathe. It was like sleep paralysis. The flashes of light were quick, just milliseconds, but each time they shone, I saw something different. Tools, tables full of objects I didn't know what they were, figures moving around me. I could never see them clearly. The flash always ended up too quickly to make anything out. My longest memory of what happened to me at that time was undoubtedly the worst. I have the memory of seeing my own body open, exposed as if I was being operated on. But I felt no pain, just cold. Very cold. At that moment I could make out the faces. These were not human. At least not as we know them. Their eyes were big and dark, and their skin seemed to glow in the light. They were like aliens. They were watching me. They weren't looking at me with hatred, amusement, or pity. They just looked at me as if I were a laboratory specimen. I tried to scream, but no sound came out of my throat. And suddenly, from one second to the next, it was all over. When I opened my eyes, I found myself back on the road again in the Texas desert sun. It was daylight, and everything seemed normal. I got up slowly, my body feeling sore as if it had been running for hours. I looked around, trying to get my bearings, but nothing made sense. I tried to remember how I got there, but everything was a blur. The lights, the running, the figures, it all seemed like a dream, but the pain in my body told me it was real. I looked around, and the truck was gone. Desperate, I took out my mobile phone, and surprisingly, I now had a signal. I called the police trying to explain what had happened, even though I knew I would sound crazy. I gave them my location using the map on my mobile phone, and they came looking for me. The police came and asked me questions, but I had no answers. They took me to the station, and after a medical examination, they said I was in shock and that I had suffered some kind of hallucination or panic attack. But that didn't explain one thing even the doctors didn't seem to understand. They found my truck more than 15 kilometers from where I was. I went back to the truck after they checked it, but they found nothing. There was no sign of a breakdown, no sign that it had been out of order. It started without any problems, as if nothing had happened. When I tell the story, not everyone believes me, but even if they think I'm making up the story or telling the truth, they all agree on one thing. Marfa's lights are really scary. Whether I had a panic attack, as the doctors tell me, or I was abducted by aliens is something that doesn't matter to me anymore. I just know that I will never pass by that place again. This story is based on the legend of the Marfa lights. These lights are said to appear in Texas. Over time, several scientific explanations have been tried to be given, but many believe that this phenomenon has no explanation, at least not on this planet.